Okay, as a quick review, we were talking about comparing investment alternatives. We said that one reason is credit rationing, that we can't choose all investments that may be available to us. And the other reason was for mutually exclusive investment, meaning where we need one investment and we have multiple options. So we're going to choose one, so we have to rank them or choose between them. And we determined that the net present value, if you have different lives for your investment, was not appropriate. So we went to the annuity equivalent as the decision criterion. Today we're going to talk about the leasing of assets and services of an asset. We're going to talk about, just briefly, an operating lease, a custom hire, capital lease, and a leverage lease. The reading assignment now is Chapter 13, and also today we're likely to be into Chapter 14, which is the cost of financial capital. If you look at leasing and leasing arrangements, the one is the operating lease, which one you may be the most familiar with. It's with a short-term rental arrangement. You're charged based on the time of use. That's the type of things that you find in You Rent 'Em. These shops where if you need a welder and you only need it, maybe once a year, once every 2 years, instead of buying the welder, you might go to these You Rent 'Em stores and lease the welder for a day. May charge you $60 for the day, and you take it back, as opposed to purchasing a welder. There's lots of other types of things. For example, if you own a property and the carpet starts to bunch up and get loose, you can go to these You Rent 'Em places and get the carpet kickers. The other is the custom hiring, which is used frequently in agriculture, where you hire the labor and the use of a tangible asset. For example, many small farmers don't have enough acreage to afford to buy a $160,000 combine. They just can't pencil it out. It's cheaper for them to get somebody to come in and to harvest their grain. They're basically leasing, in this case, not only the combine, but also the labor by which is used to cut the grain. It's the same in hay equipment. And maybe even some of you have made arrangements in your summer to make money where you're using the family farm hay equipment to not only put up the hay of your own farm, but also custom hire or have an agreement with your neighbors to do theirs. So it can go both ways. You can be the one that provides that custom hire service, or you can acquire that service. Another leasing arrangement is the capital lease. With that is a long-term arrangement where you acquire control of an asset. And in the newspapers, for example, if you look through the car section every once in a while, you'll even see that you can lease cars. You can lease the BMW that you want for $400 a month. That kind of an arrangement, instead of buying it, instead of having to put out the down payment and then be responsible for all the cost of owning that car, you can actually lease it. And that's also true in agriculture. Instead of purchasing the tractor, there are companies that will lease a farm operation on a long-term 3-year, 4-year basis. They will actually lease that tractor. And there's lots of terms that can go with that. How many hours of use, or how much you can buy equipment for at the end of the lease term. There's lots of arrangements that can be made within that. Okay, and the payments then, instead of paying the payments to the bank, you're basically paying lease payments to the lessor. You might even think of your apartments that you're renting as a capital lease, because you have a long-term year, maybe even you have it longer than that, maybe 2 years, where you're leasing that apartment. And again, instead of paying the mortgage payment if you'd bought that unit, you're paying the landlord or the lessor. The other one, a little more complicated, but also somewhat a little more interesting, is the leverage leasing. With this, it's an extension of a capital lease where you're trying to gain control of some capital asset, but you have formal involvement of a lender in providing the debt capital. This was developed by creative financing in large agribusinesses and corporate firms. We can bring an example where you can maybe think of how you might be able to use this type of a lease. Suppose that you're getting your degree in poultry science, that you want to raise chickens for Sanderson Farms. If you've got the expertise to grow chickens for Sanderson's farm, what do you have to have? You got to have land, you got to have the barns or the sheds, you got to have the equipment. I don't know if you need roosters or not, but you at least have to have the chickens from somewhere. You got to buy the chicks or whatever that go into it. All of that does require capital. And you may have the expertise and the knowledge from your training, but what don't you have? That's where you don't have the capital, right? How are you going to gain access to the land and the sheds and the chickens and the equipment that you need to set up the contract with Sanderson Farms? Now, if you go out and try and borrow the money from the bank so you can buy it, what is the bank going to want? They're going to want a down payment, aren't they? Credit history, some experience, and do you have any of that? Probably not. So you think you're going to be able to borrow the capital unless you got somebody to co-sign for you? Well, you could wait for it. You go work for somebody else. This is where a possible arrangement with this leverage leasing could possibly take place. If you know, for example, maybe a lawyer or a doctor or somebody that has good credit, has capital, looking for an investment, they know you, they have confidence in you, they might be able to put $100,000 down, borrow another $900,000, so you have a big operation. Let's say the local doctor that you know, they're the ones that could actually purchase the land and the sheds for this poultry operation. In turn, they go to you and set up a long-term lease arrangement that says that you will lease that facilities for 10 years at X amount of money. That could be a cash lease or a shared lease, whichever, very likely it might be a shared lease. And then you would contract with Sanderson Farms to produce X amount of poultry. Now that contract with Sanderson Farm would probably be in place, and the contract between you and the doctor would be in place. Then you would go to the bank, secure the financing, and then the construction would start, or the purchase of an already existing poultry operation. There's ways in these creative lease arrangements. You see, you win because you're using your expertise then to manage the operation. The doctor wins because they have a good investment. The bank wins because they're basically making a loan, and Sanderson Farm has a secure supplier of poultry. You can see this is a kind of an arrangement that can be done. You can be creative. For example, this didn't work out, but I have a friend who's a very good mechanic. But because of some misfortunes of having his tools and stuff stolen twice, he finally decided that he didn't have the resources to be his own entrepreneur. I offered to set up a shop for him. I would have purchased the shop, I would have supplied it with the tools and insured it against theft, with the agreement that he would have leased it for over a given period of time. In this particular case, this individual decided not to do it, but trying to get you to start thinking in your minds, there are ways that you can capitalize on this type of an arrangement, depending on which side of the street you're on. In this case, I was on the side of wanting the investment, but you could see where you could be on the other side where you're just starting out. There's people out there that are willing to do that type of an arrangement. Obviously, you may not have something right now in mind, but this is a tool that might present itself. Whether it's a veterinary clinic or whether you're boarding horses, there's ways for you to combine somebody else's capital with your skills. Okay, now let's go to the economics of leasing. Obviously, if you're in business or even personally, you want to control assets or services. Just like in the poultry, you wanted to control the land and the sheds and the equipment that are needed to produce poultry. Okay, well, how do you gain control of those assets? You look at your options, and the first one that somebody said when I asked that was I buy it. And certainly that's an option. If you buy it, you have control over it. But the other one that you have to think about also is leasing. And in agriculture, leasing is an important way that is used to control assets, whether it's the land or other facilities. simply because the capital cost of the assets required to run a economically feasible farm or ranch is very high. Okay, now in this particular case, if we're looking at a tractor and we want to gain control of that tractor, we can buy it or we can lease it. If we buy it, we certainly don't need to lease it, and if we lease it, we certainly don't need to buy it, so we have this mutually exclusive arrangement again. So it shouldn't surprise you then that in the economics of leasing we are going to look at this. The decision criterion is going to be the annuity equivalent, just as we did when we were looking at whether to buy the green tractor or the red tractor. In this case, we're looking at whether we're going to buy the green tractor or lease the green tractor. It's still one or the other, so we can use the annuity equivalent. We're going to continue now then looking at the control of one of these green tractors. And because they're mutually exclusive, whether we buy the new one or the used one or leasing it, it's mutually exclusive. We don't need 3 tractors, we don't need 2 tractors, we just need one. We're going to calculate then the net present value for buying and leasing the new tractor. And again, we're going to omit the operating revenues because of whether we lease that tractor or buy the tractor, it's the same tractor. So it provides the same revenues. Then we calculate the annuity equivalents. Now, from the previous lecture, we decided that the annualized cost of the purchase of the new tractor was lower than the annualized cost of the used tractor. We've already calculated that. The next step then is to look at what the annualized cost will be if we lease it. Now, this information we put up on the screen, but we didn't go over some of the information on the lease. We're going to assume that this lease payment is constant throughout the lease agreement. And we're going to assume that the lease payments would be made at the beginning of the year and that the lease ends at the end of the 8th year. So this is an 8-year lease. The last payment, however, is at the end of the 7th year, which is the beginning of the 8th year, and the first lease is paid at the beginning, just like you do your lease payments or your rent payment on your apartments. We're going to assume that the repairs and the maintenance will be paid by the lessor, and also assume that Mr. Aguirich could claim the tax deduction due to the lease payment when it is paid or beginning of the year. Now that's a big assumption, and that we can only get away with it if we make the lease payment in the previous year before December 31st. Okay, if you're on a cash basis accounting, if you want that deduction right at the very beginning, then you'd have to make that lease payment in the preceding year. This may make more sense if we lay it out on the cash flow. Now for this worksheet for the net present value, okay, the cost is 0 because we're not buying it, we're leasing it. Since we don't buy it, there's no depreciation, and because we don't buy it, there's no terminal value either. So we're concentrating on, in this particular case, the after-tax net returns. Now, if you go back to the data information sheet that's in your slides, it says that the lease payment is $7,000 a year over the 8 years. This is negative because it's the lease payment. There's no positive here because we omitted the revenues because they were common between the purchase and the lease. The lease payments are tax deductible in business. For business purposes, they are tax deductible, so we multiply it by 1 minus the tax rate. Again, the marginal tax rate was given in the data information sheet. And it shows us then that we have a after-tax lease payment then of $5,250. Now as we set this up in our timeline is critical because notice that the first payment is at time 0 at the beginning of the year. And notice that this goes over 8 years, but the last payment is at the end of the 7th year or the beginning of the 8th period. As we said before, the depreciation is 0 because we didn't buy it. And the terminal value is 0 also because we just give it back. We're not selling it. Now this problem could become more complicated, and in fact, if you're reading the textbook, their example, they complicate it a little bit because they allow the farmer to actually purchase the tractor at a given price at the end of the lease payment. And when you do that, you have all the tools to handle that, because then it just adds the complexity of the purchase of the tractor along with the lease, and you just have to spread it out in the timeline again. But we've kept it simple. We're just going to give the tractor back at the end of the lease agreement. To calculate the net present value, it's simply, you can see that we have a uniform series of payments, and we can take 7 of these payments at the end of the period, and we can bring those back as a uniform series present value factor. Remember, we calculated the discount rate for this problem. We're not pulling that 9% out of the hat. We calculated it. But notice that this is for 7 years. But this payment that was at the beginning of the period doesn't have to be discounted, so we just add it. Could I have just done this and put an 8 here? Would that have worked? The answer is no, because this USPV factor is based on end-of-period cash flows. So we do the arithmetic, and it comes out to a net present value of a negative $31,673. So the annuity equivalent for leasing the new tractor, we take the net present value, and we're going to scatter it over 8 periods. Now, you need to flag this because this can get confusing. The payment, the previous timeline showed it over 7 years. Well, that was because the payments were at the beginning of the period, but the service of this tractor is over 8 years. Okay, the payment's at the beginning, but we have access to that over 8 years. If you don't flag that, it's going to bite you. When you look at those, the previous chart and in this chart, you understand where the cash flows are. So what we want to know is what the annualized cost is over those 8 years, because we have access to that tractor for 8 years. Again, you can see that we can use the present value uniform annuity because we have a present value and we have a uniform annuity. And the net present value is this $31,763 that we calculated on the previous slide. The discount rate again is 9%. The number of periods is 8. We calculate this annuity equivalent. So it's 8N, 9% I. We have the $31,673 as your present value, zero out the future value, and we calculate the annuity equivalent, and it comes out to be a negative $5,722.50 is then the annuity equivalent or the annual cost of this lease. So we set it up in our chart. This is a continuation of the annuity equivalent for the new and the used. Now we add the lease, where we have the net present value and the annuity equivalent. Now based on this new information, which do we choose? Which one has the least cost? And you can see then that in this particular case that we choose to lease the new tractor.